I'd like to start with a bit of a apprentice story in carpentry. A friend of mine worked with a fellow who apprenticed in carpentry, I believe in England. And one evening, the fellow was talking about his apprenticeship. He said the very first day, the old carpenter gave him a rusty saw, a plane, a jack plane that was all dull and rusty and in pieces, and also a trunk of a tree about 4 feet long and maybe 8 inches in diameter. And the old fellow said, what I want you to do is take this rip saw. The saw was a rip saw designed for cutting lengthwise in wood, as opposed to a crosscut saw, which cuts across the grain. You know, take this rip saw and cut this trunk down the middle, lengthwise. And then with the plane, I'd like you to smooth both surfaces so that they're perfectly flat. And then he said, you'll know when they're perfectly flat because when you stick the two pieces together, if you lift the top one, the bottom one will come with it due to suction. And then he left and went back to what he was doing. So the fellow was, needless to say, set back a little bit by this assignment. And of course, to do it, he had to learn how to de-rust and sharpen the saw, sharpen the plane, adjust the plane, etc. So it sounds a bit brutal, but does it seem sensible to everyone who's listening that learning about the tools that you have to work with does make sense at the beginning? Thumbs up, thumbs down. I can't necessarily see everybody on the screen, so a similar thing happened to me. I was working on making a mandolins. I don't make mandolins for a living. I make them as a hobby. And one time, Reverend Elliston was visiting, and I was describing bending the wood to make the ribs or the sides of the mandolin. And I said, maple's very nice because when you bend it, the heat from the bending iron makes it smell like maple syrup, which is very pleasant. I said, mahogany, on the other hand, when you bend it and then put it into the jig or the mold and clamp it in there to cool, most woods will just stay put. Once they're cooled, they're bent and they stay that way. Mahogany, you take it out of the mold and it goes spring and it's back straight again. It's stubborn that way. And Abbott Ellison said at that point, well, if anything's going to change, it'll have to be you. The wood can only be itself. So, which much like the old carpenter giving the student a rusty saw and plane, it was one of those things that makes you think for quite a while and makes you kind of ponder for quite a while. I think it applies not only to working with wood at this point. So what I'd like to do in this talk is discuss what we've been given to work with from our Zen ancestors, both past ancestors and more recent ones. And then sort of go off track a little bit and discuss what modern science has given us to ponder concerning the mind. And then come back to what does this all have to do with our Zen practice and or making a mandolin. I realize that much fewer people here are interested in building mandolins than are interested in Zen practice. So I'm hoping you can take whatever I say today and apply it metaphorically to whatever it is that you happen to do, either as a profession or as a hobby or in day-to-day life. So I'll start with Reverend Matsuoka, since he was our O-sensei or founding teacher in our lineage. And in his And I'm going to ask as I do this, if I could share my screen. I'm going to give that a try and see if it works, just because I have a bit of some pictures, a slideshow kind of a thing. And we'll see if this works or not. Just give me a second.
Your co-host, it should work.
Okay. Well, we soon find out. I'll try not to waste too much of your time with this.
And post. There you go. Yeah, it's working.
Great. I'll just put it on the slideshow. Okay, those are some mandolins hanging on the wall. Once there's too many to hang on the wall, they start to pile up in the corner, and my spouse starts to say something's got to give here. So I try to get rid of them. Here, there.
Tesshin, I'm not seeing mandolins. I'm seeing a black and white rectangular screen.
How about now?
No.
No,
Are you on
mandolins, no mandolins yet.
Are you on two monitors, Tesshin?
No. I'll try again. Give me a minute.
We had something, but now we, okay.
Are you running PowerPoint?
It's not PowerPoint, but a freeware version of it.
I'm gonna make you. Oh, let's see.
How about now?
Now we see Zen practice at home in the Kiyosaku.
Okay. Now the thing will be, can we control it from here? Oh, yes. Now can you see mandolins?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for letting me know. I'm going to start with the Kiyosaku, a piece of Reverend Matsuoka wrote concerning meditation. And it says this, but meditation is not necessarily easy. For some people, it is torturous to have to sit for only a few minutes in silence. Their minds and bodies are not at rest within themselves. They can only be at peace if they are moving about, saying something, or doing something. In Zen meditation, it is necessary to sit for a length of time in absolute silence. Even though your mind may not be calm at the onset of meditation, after you have practiced it for some time, mental quiet will become part of your life. It will soon be natural to you. And he also adds, enlightenment is contained in Zen meditation. Meditation is not a means to an end. This is why it's so important that we practice Zen meditation whenever possible, and often, at least daily. It's not just sitting in relaxation, although it rests your mind. It is begun with a pure motive and a firm determination to sit in meditation without desires to accomplish anything. So with this, Reverend Matsuoka is giving us a sort of a forewarning. You know, you may feel antsy as you're sitting, and so carry on. And the subtitle of this talk is taken from Precious Mirror Samadhi, and or Hokyo Zamai, which is a piece that was written by Tozan in the 9th century. Tozan, Soto, the To in Soto comes from Tozan's name. So he's considered a very important figure in our history. And I'm not going to read all of Precious Mirror Samadhi. It's in the practice book that you have there in Atlanta. And it's under Sundays, or sorry, let me find it, under Tuesdays liturgy. I'm just going to read a few sections from it. First, at the very beginning says, the Dharma of thusness is intimately transmitted by Buddhas and ancestors. Now you have it, preserve it well. Then later it says, it is a standard for all things. Its use removes suffering. Like facing a precious mirror, form and reflection behold each other. You are not it, but in truth, it is you. And even later, wondrously embraced within the complete, drumming and singing begin together. Penetrate the source and travel pathways. Embrace the territory and treasure the roads. You would do well to respect this, do not neglect it. It is not a matter of delusion or enlightenment. Within causes and conditions, time and season, it is serene and illuminating. So minute it enters where there is no gap, so vast it transcends dimension. A hair's breadth deviation, and you are out of tune. Now there is sudden and gradual in which teachings and approaches arise. With teachings and approaches distinguished, each has its standard. Whether teachings and approaches are mastered or not, reality constantly flows. Then later, when inverted thinking stops, the affirming mind naturally accords. Ministers serve their lords, children obey their parents. Not obeying is not filial. Failure to serve is no help. So backing up a bit to when teachings and approaches arise and are distinguished, each has its standard. Whether teachings and approaches are mastered or not, reality constantly flows. So this is interesting in that it doesn't matter whether we do this well or poorly, reality is going to keep pounding at us regardless. So it doesn't care in that sense. And so similarly, if you're working with wood, it's going to show any weakness in your skill set, whether you like it or not. The mandolin will be living proof of just exactly where your skills lie, and any areas that need to be worked on will be all too obvious. I have a friend, when I finish a mandolin, I used to show it to him, and he would take it and start, you could see his eyes kind of roaming over the mandolin, and they would stop where there was a glitch or something wrong with it, which is not sort of to say something negative about him, but more to say something about the nature of a part of our mind, that it tends to come to a screeching halt when it notices something wrong, whereas it could graze over or glaze over or flow over 20 things that are right, perfectly right, but it screeches to a halt when it sees something that is an error. Now, from our ancestors, we also have been given to help us try to keep ourselves in tune with reality. Things like the Zen, the paramitas, the Buddhist paramitas, dana, generosity, sila, virtue or morality, virya, diligence or effort, shanti, patience or forbearance, tolerance. It's interesting that they have endurance too. Endurance could be thought of like virya, vigor, effort to keep going, but it could also be seen as enduring the difficult. And then dhyana, meditation, prajna, wisdom. I'd like to switch from things that our ancestors in Buddhism have given us to be helpful to a couple of things that in modern science studies of the brain and how it works. This author, Betty Edwards, Dr. Betty Edwards, she teaches at University of California at Long Beach, which is interesting because that's where Reverend Matsuoka had his zendo toward the end of his life. And what she has done is she took modern left brain, right brain theory and applied it to art. She's an artist and an art teacher. And what she did was in her book, and I recommend this book for anybody who has to teach. The reason I ended up knowing about it was I'm trained in science. And as an elementary teacher, you have to teach everything. So I had to teach art. So I went to the vice principal and said, I have to teach art. I can't even draw, picture of my own hand. What am I going to do? He said, you should read this book. And I knew he was a very good art teacher. And so I read it, and it was a real game changer. And in her book, she talks about what the left brain does and what the right brain does, or their natures in a bit. The left brain is our sort of logical, analytical side of the brain. And many of you probably already know this, so bear with me. It's verbal. That is, it's the side of our brain that speaks. And it's symbolic, which is the side that uses symbols. For instance, these letters we're reading are symbols for certain sounds in our English language. It's abstract, so it can do things like algebra. Temporal, meaning it keeps track of time. If somebody said, I want you to keep track, and in about 5 minutes, let me know, it would be left side of your brain that does that. Rational, digital in that it works with numbers. Logical and linear, tends to think one thought after another in a straight row. The right brain is nonverbal. It can't speak. It's synthetic in that it tends to put things together to make wholes. It's concrete rather than symbolic. Tends to be able to see what's really there. For instance, if you're trying to draw a face, the right side of your brain has the ability to see the curves and the amount of curve and the angle of the lines and take note of them, where the left brain has a tendency to make a symbol. For instance, how many of you have drawn a face and simply drawn an oval for an eye with a dark pupil in the middle? That's a symbol for an eye. It's not what an eye actually looks like. Analogic, non-temporal, right brain cannot keep track of time very well. So I've heard artists say, sometimes they'll start doing a painting or drawing and they'll think 20 minutes has gone by, but then when they check the clock, 2 hours has gone by. So they're using the right side of their brain to observe what's there, and they lose track of time. It's non-rational. Spatial, that is, it notices where things are in space and the distance separating them. Intuitive and holistic, sort of seeing things as a whole. You might ask, what does this have to do with Zen or with making a mandolin? And the answer is everything. I'll get to bits and pieces of the details in a bit. This would be she would give a pretest to her students who were college students, say, draw your face and, or draw a face. This is an example from Lyman Evans, April 2nd. Then she would give them certain activities which would help them learn to switch from using the left side of the brain, which tends to be dominant in the majority of people, to using the right side of the brain. Now, and in her book, she points out that most people, the majority of people, their development of their art skills, their ability to draw or paint realistically, tends to plateau at about age 10. And this was of interest to me because in the latter part of my career, that's the age I was teaching kids who were about 10 years old. So she would give them certain activities, such as she would have them draw half of a vase, just the outline, and make it look like a face. And as they were drawing it, say forehead, eye, nose, upper lip, lower lip, chin, neck. So that's definitely using the left side of your brain, naming the parts, because that's what the left side does, and essentially drawing symbols for them. Then she would have them draw the other side of the vase. And this time, the only instruction was make it exactly symmetrical to the first half. And what most students would find is there would be a moment of or moments of frustration, irritation, and then they would find they would start to look at the first half in a different way. And when I tried to do it, I ended up with my hands doing this, kind of picturing symmetry to try to get the thing correct. And I was definitely approaching it in a different way than I normally would with the left side of the mind. This would be the same student a month later. So obviously something has clicked as far as them seeing a little more of the details of what's really there as they're trying to draw a face. The other part of what I want to add or throw into this mixture is something that came from Dr. Howard Gardner from Harvard University called the multiple intelligence theory. And again, you may already know about this, so bear with me. In the traditional school system, 80% of the time, and this still exists as far as I know in most schools, 80% of the time is focused on your linguistic skills, your ability to read and write, and your logical mathematical skills, the top two of these. And in the past, if someone was good in these two strands of intelligence, they were considered a traditionally, intelligent student or a good in quotes student. And what Dr. Gardner did is he pointed out that there are other strands of intelligence, like your musical, rhythmic intelligence. Some people can hold a beat and some people can't. If you've ever been to an open mic to listen to music, you will experience that sooner or later. And visual spatial, your ability to draw, for instance, is your visual spatial, or your ability to look at a room and know what would make it look homey and nice. Body kinesthetic, the kid who can pick up the basketball and dribble faster, quicker, learn it quicker than anybody else would be strong in their kinesthetic strand of intelligence. Then interpersonal would be your intelligence in dealing with others, dealing with other people, maybe even dealing with other anything. For instance, if you're a potter and you make a goof and you pick up the wet clay teapot off the wheel and fling it against the wall in anger, you're not dealing too well with that piece of clay at that point in time. And then your intrapersonal intelligence, which is your understanding of your own emotions and ability to deal with them rather than having them run roughshod over you and making your life more difficult than it has to be. Somebody with a short temper, which I had as a child, my sisters used to say, "Run, his ears are turning red," which I guess happened when I lost my temper as a child. And so your intrapersonal intelligence is your ability to deal with your own emotions. And again, what does all this have to do with our Zen practice? Well, notice that the top two, verbal linguistic and logical mathematic, if we go back, they fall on the left side of the brain. Verbal and digital and analytic and rational, all of that comes under math and written literacy. Oops, wrong direction, forgive me. And notice that the interpersonal, visual spatial, they tend to fall under the right side of the brain. And since most people tend to have the left side of their brain dominant, to me, it makes sense that we learn what the left brain is good at and what it's not good at. So we're not trying to use it for what it cannot do. Left brain is no good if you're trying to draw an accurate portrait of somebody. If you're trying to get the carving on a mandolin so that the arching is just right, there's times when the left brain is useful, like if you have a template to compare it to, because the left brain is very good at comparing, which is taller, which is shorter, which is longer, which is fatter, which is skinnier, that sort of thing. But if you're trying to sketch out a new design for the head of a mandolin. The left brain is not as good as the right brain for that. So with our Zen practice, if you sit down in Zazen with the instruction, just sit still enough, long enough, as Abbot Ellison often says, you can see where the left brain might be the one giving us the most trouble. For instance, if you're thinking in your mind in words, which many of us do, then we know we're on the left side of the brain, because the left side of the brain is the only one that can speak in words. And we also know that it's symbolic. It likes to take little symbols and use them as if that's the whole thing. So it might come up with something like, "Ah, this is boring. I want to do something else." So if we can identify that, so that's just the left brain doing its thing, it might be a little easier to settle into stillness. So this next part of this slideshow is just some of the steps that are used in making a mandolin. And at the very end, I'll put a piece from YouTube that is a mandolin traditional tune played, you know, for your enjoyment. So very with the precepts. If you want to put out some effort, try dragging your chainsaw through the woods a couple of miles, cutting through an old tree that's been blown down by a hurricane, and then carrying the pieces back out, because the pieces have to be about 2 feet in diameter in order to be big enough to make the back of a mandolin. So it gives you lots of opportunities to practice and try to perfect the paramitas. This would be red maple. The best mandolins, in my opinion, are made out of sugar maple, which is harder than red maple. Sugar maple used to be called hard maple back home in the Adirondacks, and red maple was called soft maple, but both make good instruments. The red maple has a more bassy sound to it, and the sugar maple has a more trebly sound. So that's what's used in most bluegrass instruments. This is a piece of walnut that was given to me by Dr. Brian Price, Chiziki, who's in the room there, which is generosity. This is a piece of hard maple, curly maple it's called, because it has a grain that waves in and out. So later it has a nice look to it, what's called often tiger striped maple. This is a piece of yellow birch. Birch is really nice. It's a real pleasure to bend when you're making the ribs. It's a little softer than maple, so again, it has a bit more of a bassy sound. The native people where I grew up in the Adirondacks and here in Nova Scotia, when they were dealing with wood, they didn't have a saw. Originally didn't have metal. It was sort of stone technology. So they did a lot of splitting of wood, especially cedar for building their canoes. And when you split wood, it splits with the grain. When you saw wood, you can saw across the grain. If you're trying to bend wood and you've sawn across the grain, it will break, much more likely to break than if you've split it. And this is what a tool called a froe, which is used for splitting wood. There's a bandsaw for sawing it. Patience is one of the paramitas. When you cut a piece of wood, you usually, if it's going to be the back or the top of the mandolin, it's split into wedges or sawn into wedges. So that the grain on the 2 wedges will match. When you open them up, it's called book matched, and the grain on the left matches the grain on the right. And you have to let it sit there for a year for every inch of thickness. And most pieces of tone wood are aged for 5, 6, 7 years before you use them. So if you're impatient, may not be the hobby for you. This is an internal mold. It shapes what the outside of the mandolin is going to look like, how symmetrical it's going to be. To me, it's similar to our Zen practice is internal. but it shapes what's external. These are the blocks, and they form the corners, the tail and the neck, where the neck attaches, so it's important that they're strong. And nobody sees them except you as a builder. So you could leave them rough, but then it wouldn't be as nice a gluing surface and it wouldn't be as strong. And if you hollow out things a little bit, take away the wood that's not necessary, it makes the mandolin lighter and it gives a larger surface on the top and the back to vibrate, so you get better sound from your instrument. They sell bending irons for $100, $200. And I was too stingy to want to do that. So I made my own. It's just a couple of piece of galvanized pipe and an elbow and another piece of galvanized pipe with an adapter. You just put a light bulb in there. This is a long light bulb, similar to what they would use in aquariums, I guess. And it just happens to fit in this piece very well. And then it heats it up enough that after it's been on for 5-10 minutes, if you touch water to the surface, it will boil. It's the pipe is just the right temperature, not to burn the wood, but to heat it up enough to bend it. When I lived in Atlanta, there was an instrument maker up in Brasstown, North Carolina. He was originally from Austria. And he said when he bent wood, he tried to not add any water. He said, why would I add water to wood that I've just spent 7 years drying out? And so when I first started bending wood, I would hold it over a tea kettle spout and let the steam get it hot enough to bend it. Now I use a bending iron, and it's a better way to do it. This is just a belt sander. If you go to bend the sides, here would be a pair of sides that are ready to bend. If there are any scratches, it's like having a scratch in glass. If you want to cut glass, you scratch it and then give it a knock, and it breaks right at the scratch line. The sides will do the same thing. So you have to sand out the scratches or scrape out the scratches. Scraping is better. Reverend Elston explained that to me because he also works in wood, that you get less sawdust to breathe if you use a scraper. So at first a plane to get it down thin enough, then scrape to smooth so there's no scratches in it. That would be a side that's ready to bend. As you can see, it's much smoother. This would be a side on what's called an F style mandolin. F stands for Florentine. The Gibson company, Orville Gibson, invented the Florentine style. There's the pear-shaped style mandolin, and a Florentine style just has this extra curly Q scroll on it. Most bluegrass players use a Florentine style, and this is the wood being bent for the side around that. In Italy, they have what we call in hills a potato bug mandolin. It has a rounded back like a lute, whereas the Gibson style mandolins, whether it's a Florentine style or just a simple arch top style, they have an arched top, but not a completely rounded top or back. This is the rib being bent. This was a friend's mandolin, but the headstock had broken off, so they asked if I could fix it. Yeah, as you can see, you use a lot of clamps when you're working with mandolins. And a long piece of bicycle inner tube, if you cut it into a big long strip, makes a wonderful clamp, because you can, if you go around it once, you might only have 5 pounds of pressure. If you go around it 3 times, you got 15 pounds. And the stronger the pressure squeezing the 2 pieces of wood together, the stronger the glue joint is. Needless to say, the amount of stress on the neck of a mandolin, you have 8 strings, and each string is pulling with about 20-30 pounds of pressure or more. So there's a lot of stress there. So good glue is important. This is a pocket mandolin. It's only about 4 inches wide. They came out with these back in the 1920s, the Stelling Company. They have surprising loud sound for how small they are. These are the planes that are used to smooth the wood. Because the top and the back are book matched, they have to meet perfectly when you glue them together, or else it's not going to stay together. So these planes give you a nice straight surface So that later when it's glued, this is a two pieces, the top and the bottom are the left and right sides of the top of the mandolin. And you can see where the glue joint is. What you do before you glue it, you hold it up to the light with the two pieces together. If any light comes through, it's not done yet. So again, that's where, just taking your time, looking with the right brain, not being in a hurry, allows you to do it correctly. So it works. Now, if it was perfectly flat with the top of a guitar, when the bridge pressed down on the top of the mandolin, it would want to spread that joint apart. But because it's carved and arched, it becomes like an arch on a bridge. The weight on the bridge is actually squeezing the stones together, not pulling them apart. And the weight of the bridge down onto the top of the mandolin is actually squeezing the joint together rather than tearing it apart. So if it's arched properly, it becomes a much stronger structure.
Tesshin, can I stop you and ask a technical question? It looks like you might be getting to it. I'm just curious as to what kind of glue you use.
Yeah, the glue that's used is hide glue, and it goes way back. If you were in the 1800s and you asked for glue, you would get hide glue. That was the standard glue of the time. It's made by taking hide, and you can take, for instance, if you take a rawhide dog bone, the kind they sell for your dog to chew on, and you put that in hot water, not boiling water, but hot, but not boiling, that temperature, it will start to dissolve and it will become like this. And that's hide glue. And the neat thing about it is, number one, it's incredibly strong. Number two, it's non-toxic. I mean, you could drink it. It's really sort of like Jello is what you've got there. I don't recommend drinking it, but it's not toxic. And if you need to get it apart, it's temperature sensitive and it's water sensitive. So to get apart a mandolin in order to fix it, if it's glued with epoxy, lots of luck to you, because it's not going to come apart to fix it. But with hide glue, all you have to do is put some steam on it, or take a knife and get it hot and work it into the crack. You can take the top or the back or the neck off and fix it and then put it back together again. So, and a bottle of it, it comes in the form of crystals. And if you buy a pound of it, it might be, I don't know, $10, $15. And I'm still using the pound of it that I bought back in 1990. So it lasts forever. Put it in a tuna can, add a little bit of water, the crystals dissolve. When you're done working, you heat it up on a stove. Again, you don't want it to boil, that will weaken it, but you want it hot, but not so hot you can't stick your finger in it for a second or two. Then when you're done, you put the lid on and put it in the freezer, and it stays in there until you need it the next time. This can I've been using for months and months and months.
The reason I ask is I've had some trouble with my larger painting frames popping at the joints, because the glue joint they do at the framing shop is not up to the torque or the stress that is put on those frames. So I'm bracing them with metal brackets. But I was just wondering if I use Gorilla Glue, which I wonder how that would compare to hide glue. Probably not.
I haven't compared Gorilla Glue, but there are mandolin makers who use simply yellow carpenter's glue, similar to Gorilla Glue, and they're perfectly happy with their results. I did try one time using epoxy. I thought, well, epoxy is supposed to be really strong. So I glued two sides of the top of a mandolin together with epoxy. And the first part of hollowing it out is with a chisel and a mallet. You're kind of taking out big pieces. And I've never had one come apart with hide glue. With the epoxy glue, about the third tap with the mallet, and the thing came into two pieces. So so for what I do, epoxy.
Dragging you into the weeds here.
That's okay. How are we doing on time? Because I'm going to adjust this based on time.
What time is it on the TV there?
I don't see where it is on TV. It's 11:25.
So normally this would end at what time? 11:30?
Around noon.
Noon. I mean, noon, we're finished with discussion and all that kind of stuff. So
Q&A.
Okay, okay, we're in good shape then. So that's hide glue. And this would be a roughed out top made from spruce. There's a glue joint down the middle, but it's hard to see in this picture. If it's done right, it's always hard to see. This would be the top a little later when it's getting closer to the shapes. These on the left-hand side are templates. You hold those against it to see if it's hollowed out enough or arched correctly on the outside. And then these are just a couple of chisels that would be used to do that hollowing at the beginning to rough it out. These would be thumb planes, the bottom two. The bottom one is about the size of a woman's earring. It's very small, and they're used to do the finishing of the inside and the outside when it starts to get closer to the right dimensions. The top of the mandolin is only about 4 millimeters thick, and it's spruce, which is a softwood. So you have to be careful as it gets closer. And the nice thing about these planes is they take off such a thin layer that it's hard to make, one bad move and ruin everything. It requires patience, but not as much finesse. The finesse is built into the plane. This would be the neck joint. The neck is going to go down into this dovetail, and the dovetail is tapered. The back is smaller than the front, and the outside is rounded. So you've got 5 surfaces that have to meet and match 5 other surfaces. So this is a step called the marriage, where the body and the neck are put together. And it's just like many marriages, it has its rough steps in doing it. This really is a test in your paramita of patience. This is 2 halves of the neck being glued together. I like to make them as 2 halves because the glue joint makes it stronger and like a veneer, and it's less likely to warp. The warp of one tends to counter the warp in the other direction of the other. There's a neck that's been roughed out. The 2 sides are glued together. That would be a Florentine style. It has the curly cues. It's extra decorative. This would be the holes for the machine gears to go in. This would be an A-style mandolin neck, what's called a snake head, peg head. Instead of the gears are closer at the top, wider at the bottom, and this lines the strings up with the slots in the nut. So there's less bend of the string as it goes through the nut, and it's a very good design, engineering wise. And again, it was invented by Gibson back in the 1920s. They started making some snakehead designed tuning heads on their A model mandolins. There's a neck joint. As you can see, I'm far from perfection in everything I do. Oops. These would be the linings going in. There's a thin piece of softwood that's glued in to make the rib a little thicker where the glue joint takes place and a little stronger. There's the linings in place and the back on. This would be the curly Q being carved on the back side. This would be the maple. Back being glued onto the mandolin. This would be a cherry mandolin. Cherry is a nice wood for mandolins also. And the fretboard is usually made out of very dense wood. In this case, it's a piece of ebony. Ebony is getting kind of I don't know if it's endangered yet, but it's rare. So there's a type of wood called Mexican ebony or catalox, which is much cheaper, but also very dense that I use now. The nice thing about mandolins is even the biggest piece of wood is very small. So where ebony is very expensive, like a foot-long piece might cost $60, I can get 4 fretboards out of it. So it's reasonable. Catalogs, I can get over a dozen fretboards for less money than that. This is the binding going on the outside. Binding is simply celluloid, a type of plastic. You can use wood for binding also. And then the purfling. Purfling goes in, if I noticed it on violins, it was originally used to prevent splitting, and it's still used. It also has 3 colors like dark, light, dark. So it makes contrasting color, which adds to the beauty of the instrument. This is it being glued in. It's a bit hard to bend it around the curly Q on an F style because it's such a tight radius to bend. Here it's going into the point. This is a point on the left-hand side. A piece of bone will go in there and then it will all be smoothed out so that it matches. And then a mandolin that's pretty much done on the right side. The bone I use, I found in Newfoundland. A friend and I, John Stone, were traveling in Newfoundland. We stopped just to rest. We're on motorbikes, and over the bank there was a skeleton from a moose. Somebody had gotten a moose and butchered it for the meat and 2 bones over there. So I kept the leg bone, and it has provided the bone both for the points and for the nut, which is at the top end of the fretboard for every mandolin I've made since then. It's nice and dense and it works well, and it was kind of recycling. That would be the back of a mandolin that's complete. You can see the curl and the hard maple there in the neck and on the back. That's the same mandolin from the side and from the front. And that's enough of that. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open it up to questions or comments or whatever you'd like to add to the discussion.
Are you going to play your mandolin for us?
I'll play you something at the end. I can play you something simple just to get this discussion started, I guess. Let's see. That's a tune I wrote for a friend. It's called A Walk with Michael. So, any comments or questions?
We have a question online from Stephen Carr.
John, let me interrupt again, John Hinman. If you might remind people they can send a question via chat to you.
Okay.
Thank you so much for this, Tesshin. It's just a lovely talk and a lovely tune. And it's nice to hear someone say Newfoundland without having to be taught. It occurred to me that we often hear about a sculptor working with a single piece of stone, and that the method is to cut away everything that doesn't look like King David. And I had thought at first that when you went to the forest to get a log, that you were going to cut away everything that didn't look like a mandolin. but I see that you actually assemble, and then my question would have been is when you see the log, do you hear music? But you are assembling it from multiple pieces of wood, and do you hear music during this process as you are putting the mandolin together?
I think the difference between a sculpture in marble and wood is the grain. You have to work with the grain. You could, carve the shape of a mandolin out of one piece, but it would be very weak because of the direction the grain would be going in certain areas. And when I'm getting a piece of wood, what I hear is a Husqvarna 51 chainsaw roaring in my ears. And you could, if you want to label that music, you can. My brother cut wood for a living, for many years, and he recommended I get a Husqvarna, so I did. About the time my oldest son was born. My oldest son now does research at UCLA, postdoctoral research. So and my chainsaw still works. So Husqvarna used to make really good chainsaws. And as my brother said, the thing about a chainsaw, he said, is it doesn't care what it eats. So if I'm cutting wood, my attention is on that spinning blade, and I don't tend to hear music at that point in time. When I'm playing music is when I try to hear music. And in fact, I've noticed, and this goes back to the left brain, right brain thing, because I've played in bands and solo and etc. And if I'm playing either on the fiddle or the mandolin, and it's a challenging tune, if a thought goes through my mind, I'm talking about a thought in words, then usually about 3 notes later, I'll make a mistake. Sometimes it's a little mistake and maybe the audience doesn't notice. Sometimes a bigger mistake and everybody notices, but I notice. And so there's definitely, if you think of our Zen practice, well, okay, I'm going to be still. If I'm performing, my job is to help the people in the audience enjoy their evening. I can't do that if I'm daydreaming. So I have to put my attention on the tune. The tune is what's important at that point in time, not the self. And as Buddha said, somebody asked him, what's the truth? And Buddha said, if we've got this right down through the ages, where truth is, self isn't. So I would say where good music is, self isn't, in a sense. And good jazz players, and I'm not a jazz player, I'm not at that level of ability, but they listen to each other. And one time the band I was playing in was recording something in a recording studio. And the recording engineer said, you guys are playing at each other, not with each other, which said a lot. We weren't really listening to each other the way we should be. And just like in the chanting in the Zendo, Abbot Ellison has often said, you should be able to hear the quietest person's voice. That'll let you know you're not overdoing it, chanting too loud and overflowing too much. And so then the chant melds together with everybody's voice in harmony, or likely in harmony. So I think I've gone off on a tangent from your question, but I do have to ask, are you from Canada? Is that why the comment about not Newfoundland, but Newfoundland?
Yes, I'm living in St. John's, Newfoundland. And
okay.
Also I sent a note, I think, to John saying that it's Dalhousie. And not whatever it was that I heard, but
it can get much worse than that when people try to, when they first read Tatamagouche or Antigonish.
yes. Or in California, it was Yosemite
National
Park. So thank you so much.
Tesshin, you keep quoting me things I don't even remember.
Oh, I do. You don't need to remember them anymore. I do. I need to remember them to keep myself on the straight and narrow, at least to some degree.
Something happened like that with Matsuoka. We were cleaning the temple one day in Chicago in the kitchen. He had this box of little rags about 4 to 5 inches square that he tore for cleaning purposes. Smallest rags I've ever seen. He dropped one on the floor, and as he bent down to pick it up, he said, "Precious, precious." That struck me very strongly. And many years later, I was visiting him in Long Beach, and I brought up the story. He didn't remember it at all.
Daishin, good to see you.
Tesshin gets the door prize for being the furthest away. He's in Munich.
Good to see you guys.
I owe you an apology. I have a toy for your children, but I've been so slow in completing it, and it hasn't suited me that it's taking forever to get it in the mail for you.
It's a good opportunity to connect again. I will give you some updates. Also working with wood right now, building a house for my children, and it's just the other spectrum. It's very rough. So it's going to be the opposite from your work, but I will send you pictures.
I look forward to that.
Yeah.
Anyone else on?
Can anybody else come up with how any of this applies to either your hobbies or your professional life, your work life, or your family life? Or I'm interested in hearing how other people connect.
I don't have any hobbies.
Tesshin, I'll offer my own experience. Over my entire working career, I found it helpful to repeat among some of the key people that what we focus on, what we give our attention to, usually gets better. And with that, I do have a question. Can you say just a little bit about what you notice as far as choosing the mandolin to focus on, to pay attention to? And I kept hearing patience, 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 patience. Why, where did that initial spark occur rather than another instrument? Why the mandolin? There's the guitar, which is so much more ubiquitous. And of course, there's the violin or the fiddle. Can you trace that initial moment where you and the mandolin came together?
Yeah, up here in Nova Scotia and the Maritimes in general, people have kitchen parties. Goes way back. Cayley, it's called in the Celtic tradition, and people just get together and they bring their instruments. When I moved here, I was amazed at how many people played music. You know, every second person is a fiddler, it seemed like. And if you go to a kitchen party, there'll always be 5, 6 guitars, but there's not so many mandolins. So, and there'll be a lot of fiddles too, because fiddle is very popular in Scottish and Irish music. But again, not as many mandolins. And to build a guitar, there's some excellent guitar builders up here. Otis Thomas up in Bredor and Cape Breton, his stuff is at an artistic level that I can't even come close to. And but to build guitars, you need bigger machines. Like my bandsaw won't cut that thick of wood that you would need to make the backs in front of the guitar. And I originally, the kid who lived down the road when I was about 7 or 8, his family had a couple of mandolins and he played, and he took my sister's plastic ukulele, tuned it like a mandolin and showed me how to play a tune on it. And so when I got older, I got a mandolin and it was so. And I always admired the Gibson mandolins, the sound of them. There's a very special sound to them. And I wanted to have a mandolin like that, but they were expensive. So I thought, well, I could try to make one, see what happens. So I did, and it was not very good, but it played, and it was encouraging enough to try a second one. The second one sounded all right to me. So I kept doing it as a hobby while I was working. And then after I retired, I continued. I don't do many mandolins, but if you do it for 20 years, they start to pile up. So it looks like I do make a lot of them, but I don't only make 1 or 2 a year.
Since you brought up the issue of cost of price, can you tell us a little bit about what yours are valued at compared to, say, a commercial Gibson or another?
I don't know. If I were to charge $10 an hour for my labor, which is minimum wage up here, then I would have to charge somebody about $2,000 for a mandolin plus the materials. And people aren't going to be inclined to spend that. They can go to the music store and buy a mandolin for $300. Sounds fine. So most of the mandolins I've made more recently have been given away as gifts, either to family members, or this summer I was visiting an old high school friend, and a young guy came over to mow the lawn, and he happened to play banjo. We got talking. He said he always wanted to learn how to play mandolin, and he had a brother that played guitar and another family member that played fiddle. And I had a mandolin I'd completed, and I thought this is the perfect home for this. So I left
Wow.
it. It seems like a big thing, but it's not a big thing if you got 10 more hanging on your wall. It's just something that's cluttering up the place. Better to spread it around. I would like to see the uber rich of the world practice that a little bit. Money just cluttered. It's interesting that money is symbolic, right? Back to left side of the brain. Left side of the brain gives us all the trouble, I think, or a lot of it. The money is a symbol, right, for something. It's not the real thing. And so the left side of the brain gets attached to this symbol, and somebody with, way more than they need wants to collect more and more of this symbol. I think that's got to be the left side of the brain dominating. And so again, I strongly recommend Professor Edwards' book, because I think there's something to be said as Zen practitioners to learn as much as we can to try and balance out the left brain with the right brain, and that's functioning. I think a lot of the men I know, and more men than women, but a lot of the men I know at about the age 40 or so took up a hobby that was artistic. And I think it's maybe something to do with our culture, our society is so focused on the left brain that the guys got to a certain age and the right brain was just screaming to do something with its abilities. And this is just my theory, but if you do look at our society, it's very left brain orientated, and some of what the right brain has to offer might help balance it out a little bit.
We got Steve Chirio. John.
On that question, that it occurs to me now, you're trained as a scientist, and when I do lab work or construct a piece of apparatus to do a particular experiment, I tend to think of that as being left-brained, because it will be, well, what particular kind of glass should I use, and what particular kinds of O-ring should I use? And one of my responses might be that the process of putting together a mandolin surely at some level is a left brain process, is knowing your wood, knowing 15 pounds of pressure works, this kind of glue works. So that you, I wonder whether you could put a mandolin together entirely on the left brain, or where does the right brain come into that process?
Yeah, certainly if you're, I think the left brain tends to have an either or attitude. It's either this or it's that. It's sort of part of logic, the animal has 4 legs, a dog has 4 legs. The animal might be a dog, definitely is a dog, is definitely not a dog. I think the left brain's logic tends to lean toward either or. And if you're doing science, of course, you're going to need both sides. If you think of Einstein's thought experiments, if you're building a mandolin, you're going to need both sides to look and try to see the symmetry of the arching of the top of the mandolin or the back of the mandolin, to look at a neck of a violin and to see the scroll and perfect that scroll. Often they say, Stradivarius scrolls on his violins were so well done, just balanced and beautiful. And so it's not that it's either or, either left or right. And I don't think you're saying that, but it's more like both and, as we hear in Zen often. Like we need the left side of the brain. You know, it keeps us alive. It's hardwired for survival, as Sensei has often said. We need the right side of the brain because it can synthesize and see the big picture in ways the left brain can't. The left brain simply cannot draw. It's just, and I urge people to try the face experiment Dr. Edwards has in her book, Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. She has another one where you put a portrait upside down and try to sketch it. By putting it upside down, it tricks the left side of the brain away from using symbols and lets the right side of the brain look and see what's really there. And she has a series of activities and they're excellent. I used them on myself, and a month later, instead of saying, no, I can't draw anything, I was saying, yes, I can draw. And I used it on my students in grade 5. And the ones who were traditionally very strong at math and language seemed to be the ones that made the best gains. Like I'd try a couple of those activities with them, and all of a sudden this kid went from horrible at sketching to impressive at sketching. It's like flipping a switch. She simply had learned to use the right side of her brain through a couple of these tricks that Dr. Edwards came up with. So yeah, if there's certain parts where the right brain is going to be more beneficial, other parts where the left brain is going to be beneficial. And as you've pointed out with science, I'm not a scientist. My kids are scientists, a couple of them. But in science, definitely the logic is needed. Otherwise, you can't whittle your way down through the possible hypotheses to come up with what's actually taking place. And the right side, I think, is needed because there may be a experiment design that we're overlooking completely, and all of a sudden the right side of the brain sees it, and it's like, an aha moment, as some of those old Greeks said.
Tesshin, we have a hand up from Unzan, and then maybe we could take a few of these last few minutes to hear you play. Unzan?
Tesshin, thank you for being with us this morning. It's been very, very interesting. Have you got any hints for us about how to develop the right side of the brain for us left-sided brain nerds?
I think reading Betty Edwards' book I'm sure there's other ways, but I don't know of them. But for me, reading that book was a real game changer, and trying some of the activities that she had in there. And you can find that book. It's been around for a long time. There's one that's, mine is black and white. There's another one that's a color version of it. And if you go to local library, request it, they could probably get it for you there, as well as finding it online,
I've already written the name of the book down, so I will certainly check it out. Thank you.
Let me have one quick question. Andrew and I have done some drawing workshops for architecture firms, and we've done some creativity shops here. And there's a bunch of, there's another one called The Natural Way to Draw by Kimon Nicolaides. It's a 2-year course, and you can, I think it's still available. But I had a question, maybe Steve could join in on this issue. What if you simply covered one eye and use the other eye during your exercise? And then you would cover the other eye and use the other eye during the next exercise. Are we cross-wired where one left eye goes to right brain, right eye goes to left brain?
I think it's left visual field on both eyes goes to right brain, and right visual field on both eyes goes to left brain. I may be wrong on that, but Steve, do you have?
Well, the problem is they're connected together with the corpus callosum. So even though it does go that way initially, then it crosstalks, and I don't know it works exactly.
And someone, for instance, Sensei, you are an artist, and some people are wired where the right brain is stronger right at the start. Like Nancy, my wife is, she is just a natural ability to sketch realistically. I did not have that. So I think depending on the person, the amount each side of the brain gets used can vary. I think if somebody is very strongly left brain, can't sketch at all. But again, as Dr. Edwards say, about age 10, people seem to plateau, about maybe 60% of them or more. And so learning to use that other side makes sense. Like we wouldn't at age 10 say to a kid, okay, you don't need to do any more math. You don't need to do any more reading. But we seem more comfortable saying you don't need to do any more art. You hit high school, you don't have to take art, you take other things. Same with college. I think to develop a balanced person in a balanced society, it makes sense to continue developing as many strands of intelligence as we can. It seems like the interpersonal strand of intelligence in the traditional school system gets learned mostly out on the playground, in a rough and ready way, not very thorough sometimes, and that we could just simply do a better job with it. And so both what Gardner and Edwards have to say, I think, can benefit we as individuals and we as society. And then if you think of Zen, we sit down saying, okay, I will be still. Well, that's automatically setting down the left side of the brain, isn't it? And so for people like me, where it's so dominant, I've heard in over the years that, someone who's very intellectual often doesn't make much progress in Zen. And it's like kicking a dead horse. But when they do break through, they break through deeply. And I'm still waiting for that, waiting for that. But I can get the idea of like kicking a dead horse. Is that like, and I think it's because the left brain just won't let it go. Would you just shut up and let it go and let me be still? And the repetitive nature of going back Zazen again and again and again is almost like the repetitive nature of in the forge pounding on a piece of iron. Sooner or later, it's got to give. It seems like the hotter you get the piece of iron, the easier it is to shape it. And maybe there's something about the physical intensity of Zazen that heats things up, that makes it a little easier for us to shape what's on the inside.
One last question. Do you take requests?
Depends on the request.
Do you have one you could sing for us?
No, not handy. I've got one I'll put on that I won't play it because it's got 2 or 3 different mandolin tracks on it. So if I simply play it, play the video of it, I think it'll be more enjoyable for you than if I try to play right now. Also, with age, my hands are getting slower, especially the hand that holds the pick. It feels more and more awkward. So that's not going to get any better, I don't think. Give me a second to share my screen and hopefully this will work. And thank you all for attending. It's nice to speak with you.
Or are you still on?
Maybe one of those
I
Zen
think he
texts.
hung up by accident.
You give him a minute, he might come back. I think he hung up by accident.
Yeah, I think he pressed the wrong button. We'll see if he joins again.
I'll take this moment to share a comment in the chat from Stephen. He says, my father was an art teacher and my daughter is very talented in art. The ability skipped a generation through a left brain father. Welcome back, Tesshin.
Thank you. Just give me one more second here. Let's see.
While you're getting set up, I'm going to read a few more of the comments. Joseph says, thank you so much, Tesshin. Kushin in the chat says, Gasho Tesshin. Stephen says, left-handed people are overrepresented in science compared to the general population. They're also left or right eye dominant people, and I am told they take photographs through the eyepiece differently. Tesshin, you've posted a link in the chat.
Yeah, I'm going to, I think a nice ending would be just to chant the 4 great vows. And then anyone who wants to, there's a link in the chat. If you click on that, it'll go to a YouTube video. It's just pictures of Nova Scotia and a traditional tune called McGlinchey's that's done with 2 or 3 mandolin tracks doing variations on the tune. I think you'll like the sound of that particular tune. So, beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize that beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Illusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize.
Thank you, Tesshin. Wonderful talk.
Thank you. Have a great week,
Talking
everyone.
to-
If any questions arise, feel free to email or comments. I'd love to hear people's reflections on their own application.
Reminder, this week, Wednesday through Sunday.
Yep. Any other announcements before?
I think we're good.
Okay, the link is there. Enjoy.
Wait a moment, it's he got.
Right on.